in the summer of 2009. My story basically begins in northwestern Montana, in Glacier National Park. We were standing on the edge of a cliff on a highline trail. Me along with my two brothers, Ryan and Jeremy, and a friend Scott. And the Lord had all drawn us out through that summer to do ministry in the town of West Yellowstone and beyond. And we were standing there looking out over the valley, admiring the glory of the stars. And I remember having this conversation with all of them, and we were talking about what heaven was going to be like. And little did we know that heaven would be a very near reality the next day, and our lives would be changed forever after that night. Driving home from Glacier, we were headed to West Yellowstone, and I was in the back seat of my two-door Jeep Cherokee along with my brother Jeremy, who was also in the back seat. And I remember hearing just the humming and the buzzing of the highway, kind of as half sleeping. And somewhere along the journey, I came to the kind of the horror that we're no longer on the road. I remember hearing a very rough, bumpy sound, and I quickly lifted my head up and I looked, and we crashed into a large interstate sign. And it was about that time that our vehicle began flipping violently across the highway. And it's funny how your mind thinks of things in times of chaos. And I remember thinking, I'm not restrained, I don't have my seatbelt on, and this is not going to be good. And the next blink of an eye, I remember crashing through a windshield and flying through the air. I thought that surely this has to be a nightmare, this has to be a dream. And that all faded quickly when I lifted my head, and I remember looking at the extent of my injuries. I had a lot of flesh ripped from my legs, a lot of blood. And in the corner of my eye, I could see the Jeep that was flipped on its side, billowing with smoke. And I knew this was not a dream, this was reality, and that I had two brothers that were in the car as well, not knowing anything of their fate. And at that moment, I had a profound sense of, basically, this is it, I'm gonna die. And God sent a miracle my way. I remember looking into the sky. It's very hard to explain, but I remember seeing the image of Christ looking down at me. The thorns, the cross, the blood, an overwhelming sense of peace consumed me, because I knew that Christ had suffered before me and I wasn't alone. And for the first time in all of this tragedy, I knew Christ was there with me. The pain didn't go away, but Christ was there. It wasn't long after that God sent another miracle. I remember looking to my right and seeing Ryan being lifted out of my Jeep. To this day, he has no recollection of doing so. He was literally plucked out and set down on the pavement. I remember him running towards me, just hollering my name, Dan, Dan, his older brother, just laying on the highway. And one of my first things I said was, "Where's Jeremy? Where's Jeremy?" And that's, as soon as my mind thought of him, I said, "You got to go find him." And Ryan took off, and he found Jeremy on the other side of the Jeep. Jeremy was also ejected, and he was laying unconscious, blood coming out of his mouth, unresponsive. And God sent another miracle, and that was a doctor and his wife just so happened to be right behind our vehicle. They were on vacation from Michigan, and he specialized in CPR. And Ryan remembers him running to be with Jeremy and breathing air into his lungs. So different passerbys who happened to be there, they were able to salvage, I guess, a sleeping pad that I had. All of our gear was just strewn across the highway, and I remember 3 or 4 guys lifting me on this sleeping pad and dragging me to the side of the road to the rumble strips. And before long, I had a sensation of more pain to realize that I was covered in fire ants. They had moved me by mistake into a fire ant pit. So tremendous amount of pain, just thinking, how's this possible? How am I going through this? And finally, an ambulance arrived and had my name on it, and they hoisted me up, and they put me in the ambulance. And I remember the nurse asking me, what's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? And I was trying to be really tough, and I just remember saying like a 7, and I was whisked away to the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital, and after that, my memory is pretty vague. The next thing I remember is waking up in a dark room with the sound of blinking lights and unfamiliar voices, and I realized I was in a hospital. The days to follow were very difficult. I'd have to be hoisted out of bed and be forced to walk every day. I remember when I first awoke in the hospital, this tremendous urgency to have something in just to quench my thirst. It was one of the hardest things of all the pain. I think the thirst was one of the hardest things, and I remember finally getting that drop of cranberry juice that touched my lips. And I just remember thinking of Christ as a living water. Now, all this time as I'm in the hospital battling, Jeremy was battling in a much different way. He had a traumatic brain injury, one of the worst injuries you could sustain. He was actually pronounced dead on the scene. The following day, the Bozeman Chronicle printed an article saying 1 killed in I-90 crash. So somewhere throughout this journey, Jeremy was revived back to life. I was finally released from the hospital. I had a colostomy bag, I had a walker, I had a chest plate, and I remember walking out of the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital, my head held high, but my heart was very torn with grief, because I knew that my brother Jeremy may not live much longer. And my family kept much of the news from me of actually how Jeremy was doing. And I remember finally making it home to Spartanburg after a long trip. And I remember dreading that point of when I would first see him. He was at the Spartanburg Rehab Center, and I just remember going in that second floor, getting off the elevator, walking towards his room, not knowing what I was going to see. The last time I remember seeing him was the All-American runner that he was, very fit, good-looking guy, very funny, great sense of humor. And I remember making it just halfway down the hall, and I could just see his legs, and that was enough for me. I collapsed on the floor. He had dwindled down to about 90 pounds. Very difficult to see him in that situation. And those days were very dark. The grief was very intense. But in all of this, Christ kept him alive. He kept me alive as well for a purpose. And at that time, it was hard to know what exactly this purpose was. And Jeremy finally came home after spending a long time in a brain injury center in Charlotte. And I remember that first Christmas he was home. My dad was doing his care, and still to this day, my dad has done his care for 6 years. And that first Christmas, God sent another miracle. And I remember sitting in the living room, we were all playing trivia, and all of a sudden, we heard laughter coming from Jeremy's room. And we all just, what just happened? Because at this point, he was a vegetable. Basically showed no signs of brain activity. And all of a sudden, we hear laughter coming from his room. We all run to his room, and Jeremy's smiling. And we all talked that night, and we thought, man, if God could give Jeremy back one thing, we thought maybe it'd be his voice, maybe it would be his athletic ability. What God gave him back was his joy. And through much affliction, Jeremy has remained in a wheelchair for 6 years, unable to communicate with his mouth verbally, has to get his diapers changed daily, unable to walk, and unable to do many of the things that we often take for granted. But the one thing he can do is laugh, and he has joy in Christ. And the world will look at this and say, where's the hope? Where's the purpose in the suffering? If Jeremy were on stage today, I know what he would say because he has already said it. Jeremy has a unique way of communicating with us. Because of his brain injury, he's not able to speak verbally, but his only form of communication is his left leg. And he'll wiggle his leg for yes or no, or to spell out sentences. So as the family, we hold an alphabet board and a dry erase board and a marker. We basically go through the alphabet, letter by letter, and when Jeremy gets to a letter that he wants, he'll shake his leg and we'll write that letter down. And just the other day, I asked Jeremy, I said, Jeremy, could you spell a message for me? Because at that moment, I could sense that Jeremy was going through another trial. He was in a lot of pain. And I said, Jeremy, just write something out on the board for me. And he spelled out, the Lord is my strength, he will sustain me. And I remember it was about 3 years ago, we had the idea of what if we put a paintbrush on Jeremy's leg and got a blank canvas and allowed Jeremy to paint with his leg. And I remember he was able to pick his color, and we're on the bottom, we're holding, and he's with his leg, he's making this artwork. And at the end of it, we asked Jeremy, could you name this art piece? And his name for it was Fight for Joy.